Maybe you still remember the feeling after you watched the ending of Ori and the Blind Forest or Ori and the Will of the Wisp. But sadness is not the only thing that makes this game story good. Today we'll explore how to write a good story for a game like that. I know you might have heard of or learned of this a lot of time, but this is a very useful tool for making a good story. You should use the opening to introduce some of the characters like a protagonist. You should save the antagonist for later because the antagonist will add up a lot of tensions. In Ori and the Blind Forest, this is when the game introduces Ori and Naru. Remember to give the player some emotions so they can more easily sympathize with the protagonist later when tension is introduced, which is also the second phase of the story. In this phase, the game introduces Kuro, the main antagonist. Remember that in this phase, there are rises and drops in tension. And you can also add some backstory to the character to add more personality and character to it. Finally, the tensions peak at the climax. Usually, it's the final battle in game. Ori have done very good at the climax by adding a major twist to the story. In the game, Kuro has sacrificed herself to save the whole forest, and more importantly, her last child. Next is the resolution, where the tensions drop. This is when the tensions is gone. Some games actually do not have this phase, and it's called cliffhanger. Usually you should only use cliffhanger if there is a following up story or your game is actually a horror game. Finally is the ending, and this is very straightforward. In the game, Kuro's egg hatches, which tells the player that there will be a following up game. Now you have learned the basics of making a normal story. Let's make the story better. Storytelling has three components. That is the plot, the character, and the lore. Plot is the main story of the game. Character is the personality and other aspects of the character that can relate to the player. And lore is the depth of the world, the description of items, or the backstory of some characters that you have to discover. Usually a good game story only focuses on one or two of those three criteria. Ori and the Will of the Wisp, for example, has a good character and a story, but has very little lore. While Hollow Knight has a very good story and lore, but have a limited amount of good characters. If your game is plot focused, it is either original, has a major twist, or has a meaningful story. While if your game focuses on the characters, a lot of your characters should be visually appealing and or has an interesting personality. If your game world is large, interesting, and most importantly resemble the story, then your game is lore based. Remember to focus no more than two of these criteria. And don't afraid to expand your stories by adding more endings or paths that the player can choose.